Hello everyone, thank you for joining this live event. This is lesson number 11 from the Java Fundamentals stream, and we will discuss more about Varargs. Then we will discuss about the main method parameter with some examples, everything you need to know for your OCP 11 exam. And afterwards we will continue with the static modifier, of which I know we have already discussed when used with variables. We will discuss the static modifier used with methods as well, as you can see here and as you have already seen in all the previous lessons with the main method. So this is the plan for this lesson number 11. Don't forget that if you are watching the event live, I have a live chat here, so you can simply ask me questions if you are watching the event live. And if you are watching the event recorded afterwards, as usual, don't forget that you have the comments section where you can ask questions, or you can simply find me on Twitter and LinkedIn, and I will create separate videos where necessary to answer to your questions. So let's go on with the first example. I have already created here a project, and the project as usual is using version 12. Of course, being OCP 11, you know that only the features up to 11 are important for the moment, and syntactically speaking, without that previous switch anyway, version 12 and 11 are barely the same. So let's just start with first example, and as I have said, the first thing that I want to discuss is Varargs. It is the last part of the arrays chapter, that big arrays chapter we have discussed for the last two lessons. Sorry for providing so many details, but at the same time, trust me, they are really important. If you are going into the OCP exam, you really need to know all the details about everything that I have provided you. So even if they looked boring, I promise you that if you don't know them by heart really well, it might be you might miss questions in your exam. So make sure that you really understand and learn in details everything that we have discussed in the previous two lessons. Of course, everything that I will provide you within this stream is really important, and I have already skipped all the information that I consider to be irrelevant for either practice, either the exam. So just this stream, it really contains everything that you need to know. If it's something here, it means that you must understand it, you must learn it at least for your exam. So I will just create another static method. The reason for why I create the method static, I will just discuss it after this small chapter. You will see that I wouldn't be able to actually call it directly from the main method if it wouldn't be static. So for the moment, don't mind that static modifier that I had there. Just imagine it's a normal method. I just create a normal void method, so it doesn't return anything, and I will name it M1. And the purpose of this method is to have as a parameter Varargs, so that first of all we discuss about the declaration and the syntax of declaration of Varargs, and then we'll see what they are and how are they actually related to arrays. So for example, in case of Varargs, I have to specify the type, and then the syntax uses these 3 points here, and then you have to provide a normal identifier that is just an identifier of the parameter here, so it respects the same rules as any normal identifier. The only thing that is different here, and you can of course see already, is the type that I have used, which is a syntax that you might not have seen or might not have used before. It's not a normal primitive, it's not an object, or at least doesn't look like just a normal object. It is not an array, or at least it doesn't look like an array. It's just this type followed by the 3 points, and this becomes now the type of my parameter. And the question, of course, from the beginning is, what does this mean? Well, this means actually that when you call the method, wherever you will call it, you can provide as many parameters of the type specified here as you want. So that means that, for example, method m1 could be called without parameters, or I can call method m1 with only one parameter, or I can call method m1 using as many parameters as I would like of the type that which I have specified my parameter. So this is why it is called a Varargs. It means a variable number of arguments, which is you can specify 0 or many, and you don't know when you declare the method, you just can receive as many values as are provided. So each call of the method can have different number of arguments. This is how a Varargs looks like. Now when you call it, when you declare it and when you call it, it will look something like this. When you actually use it inside the method, this really becomes as a normal array. The same way of working with arrays we have already discussed in the previous lessons, so you will just use the same here when you have Varargs. That is, if I would like to simply access the first variable that was provided, I would just write something like a of 0. So treat it as a normal array. If I would like to print out this, a of 0 would be what I would like to print. This is the first value, if any. And that if any is really important because, again, recall from the last lessons that if in an array you don't have a specific index but you use it, you will actually get that array index out of bounds exception. So in my case, for example, for the first call that I have here, if I would try to access a of 0, then this will not work because a of 0 doesn't exist at all. So just try actually to do that, try to run this method now and see what happens. Okay, if we run the method, of course what we see here is this array index out of bounds exception. So is that exception, in details the exception chapter will be in one of the following lessons, but remember this is something that happens at the execution now, and it's something that tells me that I have tried in this case to access an index that doesn't exist in a specific array. And the message is pretty clear as well. If you read in the exception message, it says index 0 out of bounds for length 0. So that this actually means the length of the array is 0, so it doesn't contain any element. So that index 0 doesn't exist neither in this array that I'm using here. So of course what I should have done first is I would have simply took the length, like the length of any normal array, and if I would like to display the value 0, I would just like first to be sure that the value exists, so this is greater than 0. So that will in this case skip the first call, because in case of the first call the length will be 0, so the condition of my if will be false. So if I now run again this code, it will simply display 1 twice, first time from this call of the method, and second time when the method was called again here with multiple parameters. So you can do this and you can see that is really happening. And this way you have seen also that again this is treated like a normal array, so including the fact that you can use the length attribute of the array, about which we have discussed previously in the past lessons. So yeah, and anyway, if you don't like something like this and you actually what you want is to always display all the values, then you can simply just use a normal for control structure, the way we have seen used in the previous lessons to parse arrays. And you can just either use a normal for, or you can and take index by index, or simply use an enhanced for. It is on your decision. I would advise you to try all of the cases to make sure that you understand them, and then just let's try to print them on the same line. that would be a of I plus a space. Okay, and at the end we also print a new line. So let's see what happens here when we call m1. M1 will only print a new line. There will be nothing printed because there is no value given as a parameter here. And then M1 will simply only display 1 because this is the only value that I have provided, and that will be part of the A array. And for the last method I will see all the 7 values because I will simply just parse the array and display all the values that are provided as parameters. So we run this application to see the output and to make sure that you understand. And again, yeah, a new line for the first call, and then 1, and then all the other 7 values that were provided. If you don't understand how is this working, don't forget that you have the possibility to use the debugger, so just use a breakpoint wherever you need and start your application with debug and parse it line by line. I will not do this now, but I just wanted to remind you that you have this opportunity. So if this looks strange and you think you don't understand it, don't forget that you can also try always to simply debug and run line by line to make sure that you have correctly understood what happens. This is the first thing that is important. The first thing that is important is that you actually understand what a Varargs is and how you can use it. Now let's see some syntaxes that are important when you have multiple parameters. So the next thing that you need to know for your OCP exam is what are you actually allowed to do when you have multiple parameters. In the first case, the case of my M1 method, I have only used one parameter to make it short and easy so that you understand what the Varargs is. Now, of course, when you go into the exam, you must know a lot of details, through which also important is to understand how can you use the Varargs when you have multiple parameters. So only one thing would be, from my point of view, important to remember, that you can use the only one Varargs in a parameter set, and that this Varargs will always be the last parameter, so you can't have other parameters declared after it. It's always only one parameter of a type Varargs, and if there are multiple parameters, always the Varargs will be defined at the end. So if I go and just try to create an M2 method here, and let's suppose that I use string x, and then I have a Varargs that I declare it as an y. This is a correct declaration. You can have as many parameters as you want, but the Varargs will always be declared as the last, and you will always be able to declare only one parameter of this kind. So if you really try to put them the other way around, as it might happen to that you will find in syntaxes of the OCP 11 exam, this is a compilation error, as you can see, so you can't do something like this. You are never allowed to add a parameter after a Varargs. Of course, that's also why you wouldn't be able to declare multiple parameters of type Varargs. That's why it's always only one of the kind Varargs, and it's always declared at the end. So this is one thing important to be remembered by you. So if I'm now declaring like this, and let's say I will print the x, and I will also print the length of y. I'm just going back to my main method, and when I try to call M2, you will see that I am is not mandatory for me to provide any value for y, but of course x is a different parameter, it's just a normal parameter, so I have to provide a value for x. So in this case, X is mandatory, but I don't have to specify anything for Y if I don't need to. So if I don't want to specify values for Y, I can simply skip them. For example, let's assume I declare here as a value ABC for X, and then you can see that I only provide X. That means that Y will be an empty array here, and the empty array in this case meaning that it has 0 elements, and the length here would be in this case of course 0. So if you run the example, you will see that ABC is outputted in the console, and 0, which is the length for the array Y. This will change of course in case you now provide values. So for example, in this case I have provided 3 values for Y. This is the way in IntelliJ is represented. So that means that the length of Y will now be 3. It is the same thing. ABC will be printed out in the console, and then you will have 3 printed, because this is the length of Y, being that I have provided 3 values for the arguments. So you just run this now, and you should see this is a correct call as well, and the values are the ones that we have expected to see. And again, you can have as many parameters as you want, but just make sure that you only have one Varargs, and that's always at the last specified as the last parameter. So you will find out in OCP 11 exam situations in which this is on purpose written wrong in the code, so that you see the compilation error and you answer correctly with the fact that the code doesn't compile. So you have to know when the code compiles and when the code doesn't compile with Java. This is the first part, and now we will complicate the things one bit more. And the next question is, what happens if you have a Varargs of arrays? So if you have a Varargs of arrays, this might become a little bit more complicated. So we just want to see what does this mean. I will create an M3, and the way we can declare something like this is to have the X as a Varargs, but of course the 3 points will be after the brackets that define my array. And if you would try to do something like this, again, another syntax that you will find in your OCP 11 exam, you might find this, where the brackets are after the points for the Varargs. This is not a correct syntax. You can't use something like this. So if you see something like this in your OCP 11 exam, you just mark that question with a compilation error, and that should be fine. So fortunately for us, we don't have to also discuss some kind of another possibility. The only thing that we have to discuss is what happens when you have a Varargs of an array. And an array can be as complicated as you want, so you can have an array with only one dimension. As well, you could have a matrix like this, or an array with as many dimensions as you want. You can review the last lesson about this kind of arrays, but this wouldn't affect us. It's just that it will work the same, but we will have one more layer above everything that you add. So what does this mean? Is actually that this X here, being that is a Varargs of an array, you have seen in the first methods, in the first 2 methods here, that when I simply have a Varargs of a normal type, like a primitive here, then this becomes an array with one dimension. So this would be array with one dimension, also known as a vector. So what would happen actually here when you have a Varargs of an array type? You already have an array of arrays. So that means this will change as a type. X will actually be here an array of arrays. So that's actually a matrix in this case. You can just imagine that whenever you have the Varargs, it simply adds one more dimension to your array. It simply, you can imagine that X just replace the 3 dots here with another set of brackets. So this is how you will imagine the parameter as a vector. If you just go up there and replace the 3 points with a set of brackets, you will again go into a correct syntax, because this is exactly what happens. The difference is when you call the method. So in this case, always treat the Varargs parameter as just a normal array. This is just a normal array. It would be the same from the method point of view, the implementation of the method point of view. It would be the same thing if you would simply replace it with the set of the brackets. The difference when you use Varargs instead of an array, it's not in the method itself, it's when you call the method. So when you call the method, you have to declare it as a Varargs if you simply want to provide the values enumerated like this with a comma. So for example, if I call method m1 and I have some values provided here, which we know now that will be part of this array. It will be the values of the A array. I can do something like this as long as I have a Varargs. I can simply just enumerate the values here. But if I would have changed the 3 dots with the set of brackets, you can see that the method still compiles. That didn't change anything on my method. But the call of the method doesn't compile anymore, because now instead of just trying to separate the values by comma, the correct way to call the method now would be to put these values myself in an array and then provide the array to the method. So it's just one step more. If I want to have an array instead of a Varargs, then that means that instead of just enumerating the value, I have to create myself now an array, and I would have to provide that array to the method itself. So that's the difference between array and Varargs. Otherwise, always think as the 3 dots here as just a normal set of brackets when you simply just try to understand the method itself. It is enough to just replace in your mind the 3 dots with a bracket, and then you will see exactly the type. So for example, if I would do something like this here, you know that X is actually an array of arrays, so it's just a normal matrix. So this is why I will be able actually to use it as a normal matrix. So if I want to just parse it as I have done in previous lessons, for example, I just want to take an A out of X, and this A would now be a normal array, because being an array of arrays, in the left side of the column operator here, I have to provide the declaration of a variable of the type of the members of the array, which are vectors here, yeah, because this one means array of arrays. And then I can use the second enhanced for here and just take from A everything, and of course inside A, that is a simple array of integers, I have integers, so that's why inside this for the declaration of the variable I use to parse the values will be of type int. This is the type of the variables that are inside A, and then I do here whatever I want with these values. Doesn't really matter. The subject is the Varargs, so I won't go any deeper into using values. I just want you to understand how this works. So you have this possibility. And the last thing about Varargs that you need to remember. So we discussed about when you use it with only one parameter. We have discussed what happens when you have multiple parameters, which are the rules. We have discussed what happens when you have Varargs of arrays. And now the last thing that we have to discuss about Varargs is how to call it. And then you will say, didn't you just show us how to call it? I mean, you've just shown us how to call it with separating the values with a comma. Is there something else? And yes, the answer is we have to discuss about something else beside that, even though probably you will not see something like this in a real life scenario. There are possibilities that you will see all the details in your OCP 11 exam. So what I also wanted to tell you about Varargs is that even though they are meant and you declare a method to call it with the values separated by comma, as I have done until now in the examples of today, you can still use arrays instead. So you can still create your own array and parse only the array. So take as an example method m1. In this case, I can simply just declare an array A and call the method m1 with A. So this might be tricky because when you do something like this, this call is actually equivalent to the one in which I simply provide the values separated by comma directly inside the parentheses of the method. So I can, and the purpose of the Varargs is exactly this, where I simply call the method providing the parameters separated with a comma, or I can put them myself into an array and then I directly provide the array. This can be tricky in your OCP 11 exam. I have seen plenty of people failing to answer this kind of code because it can be tricky, it can mislead you, especially when you have the situation in which you have the Varargs of arrays. When you have the Varargs of arrays, so for example M3 here, let's try together to see what happens with M3 to be sure that you have understood. So in this case, for example, if I want to call M3, you know that M3 can be called by providing arrays. So yeah, I have to declare some arrays like B1, B2, B3, etc., as many as I want. So I would do something like this. And let's just take the easiest case with multiple vectors when I have just two of them, but you of course know that I can have 0 or multiple, doesn't really matter. The idea is that B1 and B2 is exactly what I would just enumerate here. So you can do something like this. This is just the normal case in which, being a Varargs of arrays, you have multiple arrays and you simply separate them by a comma, or you can have a matrix and you can simply create your matrix if using a syntax like this kind, where you simply just create a matrix out of B1 and B2 and then directly specify C here. So you see that instead of enumerating the values which are my arrays, as I have done previously, where I have written something like this, yeah, I was just enumerating the values here with a comma. Now I have the values just as normal members of another array, which in this case, being that my the types of the members of the array are arrays themselves, this C will actually become a matrix. I can simply provide directly the matrix. And the idea is that I can do this for any kind of array. So if I would have a Varargs of matrices, then I would have again one more dimension, and so on. This is where the Varargs could become tricky in your OCP 11 exam questions. So make sure that you understand these syntaxes as well. If I have provided directly here a matrix, then I can provide something else here as a parameter. I either provide the matrix directly that contain all the parameters, either simply enumerate the parameters with a comma. Usually in real life scenarios, you will only see the case in which you will enumerate them with a comma, because this is basically why we have why we have declared the parameter as a Varargs. Otherwise, probably if you would expect it to receive always a matrix here, you would have you would have declared it from the beginning with a matrix and not with a Varargs. But this syntax is possible, and you will find it in your OCP 11 exam, so make sure that you understand it before. Fortunately, however, these are the only things that we actually need to know about Varargs. So with this, we can consider that we have also covered the arrays chapter, and we know everything that's needed to be known about arrays. So you should be able to pass all the questions from the OCP exam, and you should be able to get the highest mark on this part of what you need to know for your exam. Good. If this is clear, and I see no questions in the chat for the moment, don't forget, if you are watching it live, you can ask questions in the live chat. Otherwise, you can ask them afterwards in the comment section. Let's go and discuss furthermore a little bit about what is actually this parameter of the main method, and we discuss about the main method a little bit more with all the details that you need to know when you will see questions, and what are the questions possible to appear in your OCP exam. So I will just create a new Java class here, and it will be the second example. And in the second example, I will have the main method, and that's it. And as I've said, I want first to make sure that you understand what is this parameter here, why is it mandatory, and what's the purpose of the parameter. This is something that is tested in your OCP 11 exam, so you have to know it. It is as well something that you might not find it used that much in a real life scenario, but of course, as a Java developer, you have to understand at least the main method, or this is what I think. So it's important that you know what is this parameter of the main method. And theoretically, now that we have covered everything about arrays, you should be able to understand what this parameter is, and the syntax should be clear, and it should be clear at least the fact that this is an array of strings. You know that what a string is, because we have used it since the first lesson, and you know that this is now an array that can contain multiple strings. From the syntaxes that we have discussed, you know that you can also place this set of brackets afterwards. So it is not really often seen this, but in the exam questions you will see this kind of syntaxes. And one thing that you shouldn't forget, whenever you see something different on the main method than you are used to, the exam also tests the fact that you know where the main method is not the main method anymore. So remember that in Java it is really important that almost anything that you change on the main method could make that the main method is not anymore the main method. That means Java will not understand the method as being the main method anymore. So for example, if I do something like this and I simply just write it with a capital M here, that will not be the main method anymore. So instead of simply being able to run normally the application, you will get an error in the console whenever you will have something like this. If you just have here, instead of void, you will write int, and you of course in this case have to return an int. But the important thing is, even if it is compiling in Java, this is not the main method anymore. So Java will not recognize it as a main method anymore. So that's important to be known before going into the exam, especially because there are languages out there in which this is not important. So you will find out there are languages, and maybe you have learned them previously, and you know that in the main method can be void or int at the same time, and it's still the main method. But in Java this is not happening. So make sure that you remember this when you go to the exam. So I will change it back to void. It simply becomes back my main method. If I remove this static here, the same thing. The main method in Java should be static, and you will soon find out what static for methods is as well. If it's not static, it's not the main method, and of course the same with public. However, there are things that we can still change on the main method. One of them being the fact that it doesn't really matter how the argument is declared as long as it is an array of strings. So that means that the same syntaxes I use for the declaration of the arrays, I can use them here for the parameter. That means I can either have the brackets before the name of the parameter, or I can have the brackets after the name of the parameter. The name of the parameter is not important, it's just a name of a parameter. Java will not test that is named args. So that's just the usual basic name that you will see in all the cases and in all the examples, but it's not mandatory from the syntax point of view. You could have a different name. And now that you know Varargs, you can even remove the brackets completely and use the Varargs syntax, which of course now you know why this happens. This is possible simply because you know these three points here actually can be used as a normal array as well from the syntaxes that we have just discussed. So that's why in some cases you will see the main method declared instead of a normal array with Varargs. This is still okay, this is good, this is still the main method. So if you find something like this in your OCP 11 exam, it's still working, it's still the main method, you can do something like this. Remember the syntaxes to make sure. Now, what is the purpose? We have discussed the syntaxes, but what is the purpose of this parameter that you are using here? Why do we use it? Why do we always have it there? The reason for why we are using this parameter is to be able to get values from when your program would be called from the console. And to come with an example, I will just open a console here, and maybe already a lot of you know that we can use a ping tool, a networking tool, to test the connectivity in between two endpoints. Of course, it's there are more details about this, but you know probably this ping, you might have used it, and if not, it's really easy to understand it. It's just sending some ping messages in order to test the connectivity from, in this case, my computer to whatever I provided as a parameter. So for example, to Google. Okay, for example, I want to ping Google, I want to see if I have connectivity to Google, and I just can press enter, and after I have specified this is the parameter that I have provided, I can see some information that tells me that I have connectivity to Google. So I'm not interested about ping here and how it works. I'm interested in the fact that this is actually the program and this is the parameter here. So the question is, if we would have to implement this with Java, how could we actually get this from the console? How could we actually get this parameter from the console? Is it possible to have something like this with an application that is developed with Java? And the answer, of course, is yes. And this is actually what the parameter provided to the main method is. This is where automatically you will find it will be filled with these values, and you will find them here. The first thing important to know, at least for your OCP 11 exam, about this parameter here is that it is never null. It is never null. So this is important. You will never get a null pointer exception when you use that the differentiation out of the arguments parameter, because this is never null. It's at least in most cases an empty array. So if you don't have any parameters, instead of being null, it's just an array that it has length 0. That's one thing to be known. So you will find questions in your OCP 11 exam, for example, where it simply displays the length of the arguments but doesn't provide any values when calling the program. In this case it will be 0, it's not null, it doesn't cause exceptions. It will cause an exception if you would try to, for example, use an index that doesn't exist, and that will be that same array index out of bounds exception that we have already discussed. But it's simply an array that will be either empty, either contain the values, never null. So that means here, for example, in my case, if I print out the length of this array now, and just let me run this example too, you should see a 0 here because I don't provide any parameters. When we are using IntelliJ, we are not running directly the command in the console as I have done with the ping in the console myself, but we can still send parameters to test. And for example, in IntelliJ you can do this by editing the configurations when you call the running configurations. All the other IDEs have something like this, so you should be able to send parameters and see what's happening. So for example, when I do the edit of my configuration, running configuration, you will see here that I have the possibility to provide program arguments. So these program arguments are actually what I would have provided as, for example, google.com here in this case, or I could have had multiple arguments that would have been specified with a space in between. So if I want to provide multiple arguments, you probably know that I use just spaces in between them, and they will become automatically my multiple program arguments. So in this case, if I write ABC and run this program again, this example 2 again with ABC, it should take my configuration now, and you will see that instead of 0 I have an 1 here. So the length of the arguments array is 1. And of course, if you would have multiple parameters, whatever they mean, then if I have added 3, automatically they will be put in the arguments parameter, and the length of the arguments parameter would become 3. And you can even see the values. Just use any loop to parse the array and print them out, and exactly the values that I have used and I have put in the configuration you will be able to see in the console now. So these are the values that if I would have, for example, run my application with the Java command and provide them after, you will have the values as well here. Only the parameters are stored in the values of this array. So the name of the program is not stored, as you can see here. So I have simply parsed them, and you see the only thing that I can see here are the values for the parameters. I don't have anything else. I say this simply because there are questions again in the OCP 11 exam where in the answers you will also see the name of the program as being part of the output, and that output that would contain the name of the program, that is not correct. In the output that is in the array, in the array as the parameter of the main method, you will always have only the parameters that are provided when you call the program, so nothing else. And again, it's never null. It can have the length 0 if you don't provide any parameter, or it's just a normal array that contains the values that you specify when you call your program. Okay, and this is about the parameter of the main method and a little bit more about the main method, which I think and I hope it's clear for the moment. And again, if I don't have any other questions, at least now from the live viewers, I will just go to the third example, in which I want to enter a little bit in more details about the static as being used for the declaration of the method, because I remember to have already discussed the static as being used as a modifier for the variable, and you know that a normal variable declared inside the class is by default an attribute. That means that it's individual for each instance that is created with that class. But if we are using static for the variable, that will not be anymore independent for any instance. It will actually be only one, and that's why we say that it belongs to the class. So it belongs to the class, it is unique in the class, and it is actually the same, if you want, for any instance. In one of the previous lessons we have discussed that. And now I will create an example 3, and let's see what happens when you use static for the methods. And this is actually the same easy as for variables. When we don't use static for the methods, you know, it is automatically a behavior, so it is again owned by the instance. But if you use a static, then this is not owned by the instance anymore. It's owned by the class, and you can call that method without even having an instance of the class. In order to prove that, I will actually create 2 classes. I will again create a cat class, and that's the first one that I want to have here. And then I will create an example 3. With the main method. And inside the cat class, you know that I have given this example many times where I have a say meow method, and I just print out a meow here. So you know that if I didn't do something special here, this is now technically at least called a behavior. So in order to call this method, I need an instance of the class. So you also know that an instance of the class can be created by using the constructor, and again, this is something that we have discussed in the previous lessons. So if this is strange for you, if the syntax doesn't look familiar already, you can review the earlier lessons that we have discussed, in which we have dealt with everything starting from the first lesson. We have discussed about instantiation and what a class is. And now I have created an instance of the class, and I have stored the reference in the C1 variable. And now if I want to call the say meow behavior, I will simply just use the dot operator here. So you just run it now, and you would be able to see a meow in the console. But if I would have wanted to call it without having an instance at all, then I would, let's say, try to do something like this and call it directly from the class. This is not possible, because being default declared, which is a non-static, when I don't use anything special, any modifier, the way I have done, it simply automatically belongs to the instance. And that's why inside the behavior you can also use the attributes of the instance. That is actually, you can use anything that can be referred through the word this. And again, this is something we have discussed. This in Java inside the class represents the current instance, which is in this case the instance that would call the behavior. So when you call the behavior from an instance, inside you can refer to that instance using the word this. That is, if for example your cat here would have a name, then that means that you can use that name here, and you can for example output it together with the the string. And the reason for why you can use the name is because the name that you actually use, this can be seen from the fact that I refer it from this, is the name of the cat that is calling the behavior. So the name of the cat that is behaving is exactly the name that will be here. That means in my case, as the first I had the first example, I will just give it a name, and then when I say, when I call the say meow behavior here, it will say meow, my name is Tom. And the reason for why it's working like this is because C1 is becoming this inside the say meow method. So in this case, when I call say meow from C1, this inside say meow is actually the reference of C1. So that's why I see Tom here, which is actually the name of C1, because I see the name of this, which is the name of the instance that I have used to call the behavior. The problem is what happens when you make this method static. So I will just go, and as any modifier, always you use the modifiers for a method before the type. So you can put multiple modifiers, as you will see. They can be in any order, syntactically speaking, but they will always be before the type. So in my case, before void. I have added this modifier that now makes that method this method will not be anymore a behavior, will be part of the class. So will belong to the class instead of belonging to each of the instances. And because of that, because there is no instance now that owns this method, there is no this anymore. You see that this is now underlined here as a compilation error. It's a syntactical error. So because of the fact that I have added the static here, that makes this method to be part of the class and not owned by the instance anymore, the instance doesn't exist anymore. So because the instance doesn't exist anymore, that means this doesn't exist anymore. So I can't use it anymore in the code. I have to take it out from here. I have no this inside the static method. And if you go back to the example 3, you will be shocked of the fact that this is still working. So the compilation, the code still compiles even if I call it from an instance. But if you recall from one of the last lessons, we have discussed this is actually the same also for variables that we are creating static. Even though they are not part of the instance anymore, you can still use the instance to refer to that method or variable that is static, which is technically not correct. It will work fine. It's just it will simply work fine the same. Usually in a real life scenario, when we have something static, doesn't matter if it is a variable or a method, you would simply use directly the name of the class, and this way it's easier to see that this block of code is actually static. You refer it directly from the class, and you see that I don't even need to have an instance to be able to call the method now. So that's actually what the big difference is between a static and a non-static. I don't need an instance, because when it's static it doesn't belong to the instance anymore. You can have no instance and still call that block of code or still refer to that variable that is declared static. But you can still, if you want, syntactically speaking, use, as I have done previously, an instance. What is, however, important to remember is that the C1 here is just referring to the type of the class that has. So in this case I have used var, which maybe makes the things a little bit more difficult to see if you are not very used to it, but actually this is simply the same as if I would have placed cat before the declaration here. And the funny thing is that you can even make it null, and I can still call the method here even if I have no instance, I have no reference to any instance. This will still work. But this wouldn't have worked, for example, for something that is non-static. So if I go back and add the and I refer to the name here, my cat being null, I will actually get a null pointer exception, because in this case name is something that really has to belong to an instance. So I can't simply call it without having the instance. And if I would try to do that, then in this case I have this null pointer exception that, again, I remember we have discussed it also previously in earlier lessons. Being static, however, and being that it doesn't belong to any instance anymore, you can use syntactically a variable of the type of the class in which the method is found, but you might even have that variable empty. You don't even have to you don't even have it to contain an instance to be able to call the method that is static. So that's really important to understand. Okay, I think basically I have covered everything that I needed to do, or at least that I wanted to do for today. And from now on we will hear about this a lot again. Also, you have seen, and I will do that in the future as well, I'm sometimes repeating some of the things that we have already discussed, because I want to explain them together with the link to other elements. It's really important, again, also for your practice and for using Java in real life scenarios, as well as for knowing the details for OCP, to understand the link between a specific part of the language with everything else. And because of in a course like this, you can't simply just tell everything from the beginning. You will hear me rather repeating some of the things when I discuss about them linked to other things that they will come later. For example, later we will discuss about the access modifiers. So then again I will tell you that the modifiers can be in any order and placed before the type. Hopefully this will also help you to remember better all the details. And don't forget that if you have questions, you can always ask them in the comments section. If you are not watching the event live, you can use the comments section, or you can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. And if you are watching the events live, you can use the live chat to ask questions. This is it for today. Thank you very much for being part of this lesson number 11, and hope to see you soon in the next lessons. So until then, I wish you good luck and bye bye.